Today's topic is about urban growth. Today, we're going to talk about how the cities grew. We already talked about the influence of the immigrants. With more and more people coming into the cities, working in factories, what was going to happen? What would change? In 1870, 25% of the people lived in cities. By 1910, almost 50% did. In 1870, 25% of the people lived in cities. By 1910, about 50% did. Now, this geographic theme of movement totally influences what happens in the United States. It shows the causes as well as we'll talk about the effects as well. The causes, well, you can well imagine, is that as cities grew, as inventions became commonplace, such as electricity, life on the farm really became less appealing. And so many people start moving there. On top of that, many people's jobs became redundant. They didn't need blacksmiths anymore. So they wound up moving to cities. So mechanization of farming and more finished goods meant less people needed. Mechanization of farming and more finished goods meant less people were needed. We didn't really talk about the inventions that helped the farmer. Stuff such as the tractor really allowed farmers to clear more land, to work more lands. More finished goods meant, we didn't need as many artisans. So a lot of people found themselves out of work. I mean, what would a barrel maker do when there were no more barrels that need to be made when they could be produced in a factory? What about a wheelwright? Someone who makes wheels. What happened to them? Well, they wound up moving to cities. Cities grew due to them becoming trade centers and centers of production. Cities grew due to them becoming trade centers and centers of production. So not only were people finding they were not needed out in the countryside, this is where the opportunities were. This is where the railroads had built the train stations, where the factories were loading their goods onto these trains, where roads were being built, sewer lines being deployed, building subways, all needed workers. This is where we see the rise of the importance of cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, even Durham. Many African Americans moved north. Fed up with sharecropping, the tough life of farming, they moved north to the opportunities to work in factories. And just like the immigrants, like the Italians and the Irish, they also lived in little clustered ethnic neighborhoods. We call this the Great Migration, and during this time period, we see a wealth of African American thought occur. We'll discuss more about this in the progressive movement in the next chapter. We will talk about people such as W.E.B. Du Bois, such as Booker T. Washington. There'll be many people that are influenced by the Great Migration. 1920s, this blossoms into what we call the Harlem Renaissance. It's a rebirth of thinking of music, arts, and literature coming out of the African American community. Now, many African Americans also wanted to escape the hardships of segregation. However, one thing you must understand is that when they got into these cities, although there were no laws about segregation, there were customs and traditions about segregation. Now, in the pre-civil rights movement, these quickly fall apart, but there are always certain sections of the city you could not live in. Might not be laws against it, but they wouldn't sell you a house. Where you could go was also, you know, dictated by the social mores of the time. For example, what we'll do is, and then tomorrow we will talk a little bit more about social time and what people did. We'll also talk about a lot of African American culture and how it influenced, the 1890s, 1900s America. But the Great Migration, it could be a course unto itself with the Harlem Renaissance as the capstone. And everyone, particularly if you were at the bottom of the barrel, you lived in tenements and slums. Most immigrants lived in tenements and slums. Tenements were cheap buildings thrown together, thrown up basically overnight. They cut costs on safety. We talked about what conditions were like in factories. Well, in the tenements, they weren't much better. Maybe one bare light bulb. Maybe the wiring wasn't insulated or covered. It might be hanging. You would have tons of people living in one or two bedroom apartments. For example, what you would see is you would see that basically this right here would be a row of tenements. So you'd be living right next to your neighbor. In fact, you'd probably be very friendly with your neighbor as you are hanging out the laundry. And the reason you're hanging out on the balcony is because surely it's very crowded in your tenement with lots of people. Life was not easy in these tenements. In fact, one book that's really good is a book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Mr. Schwankel has it if you want to read it. And if you're looking for a fiction book, yes, it is fiction. But the woman actually did her research, and it talks about her life growing up in the 1910s and 1900s in these tenements, and talks about what life was like. On top of that, the woman also, after she became famous, moved to Chapel Hill and lived in Chapel Hill for the rest of her life. So, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is a really good book as far as fiction goes. It's sort of like a autobiography, if you will. So I do recommend it. Now, we got these tenements being thrown up, people living right next to each other, on top of each other, with each other. It's getting to be kind of crowded. So what do you do? Well, skyscrapers and parks help make cities more livable. Skyscrapers and parks help make cities more livable. When you walk around these smelly tenements and slums, you need places to put more and more people. So they couldn't expand out anymore. They'd have to expand up. And places like New York City, that's what they did. they built up. And so we see lots of skyscrapers. Now, what happens is because you don't want a huge feeling of being clustered in, that would be completely unhealthy because the tenements were bad enough. So a bunch of people decide, you know what we need to do is preserve parks or build parks so that people have opportunities to get fresh air, to have recreation, someplace to take your family on that one day off from the sweatshop. It was the idea of building moral character. Good character would help people become better people. It would break up the skyline, it would allow people to have a better quality of life and a higher standard of living. Now, what we'll do is we'll talk about the good efforts of these people in the next unit, Progressive Era. Did their ideas match with the immigrants and what the immigrants experienced? So, there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed it.